there. Excellent. Okay, so welcome along, and thank you very much for joining us for our virtual Bordeaux tasting tonight. As you'll probably be well aware, we had not intended to do this tasting virtually, and had intended to present it in Wellington and in Auckland tonight. So it was meant to be in Wellington last night. Following the government's announcement that we're staying at level 2 for a little bit longer, we decided to join it together and to move it to tonight and to do it virtually. We do have a good number of people that are going to watch the recording afterwards, particularly some of the Wellington people that had perhaps planned to do it last night. And just for those that are wondering, we have made a decision at Glengarry that under level 2 we won't do in-person tastings. The requirement to keep social distanced, and also the fact that, you know, you taste and you spit, it's just not, in our view, a responsible thing to do. So you're going to see a lot more virtual tastings until we get to level 1. And once we do get to level 1, we also intend to continue with the virtual tastings. So we are loving catching up with our customers all around New Zealand, and also appreciate that this format's really good for a number of people. So in terms of the format tonight, as we said, you've got 2 different flights there. You've got detailed what wines go in each flight, and you should also have a lovely little tasting booklet there. So you've got all the details. So I think looking around the room, there's lots of familiar names, which is great, but my name's Liz Whedon, so I'm the General Manager at Glengarry, and have with me tonight Regan McCaffrey, who looks after our fine wine and is based at Victoria Park. So being Bordeaux and something I particularly adore, I said to Regan that I was not only available tonight, but also would love to present the wines with him. So what we're going to do is a bit of a, he'll do one, I'll do one, and we'll alternate through the night, which I think is also quite good from a listening to a point of view. You won't get sick of either of our voices because we'll alternate. So that's how it's going to go. But before we get started, you know, for a lot of people, I think this is the first tasting of this 2017 vintage. This is a vintage that has just landed in New Zealand. And with any new vintage, I think understanding the vintage characteristics is really important. But before we jump into that, I just get Regan to bring up a little picture there of the region. And I won't spend all night on this, but just wanted to explain to you the order that we're going to taste, and just a little bit about Bordeaux. We've got a great little map there to explain it. So this is the area of Bordeaux, and it's centred around the city of Bordeaux, which you can see sort of there where the words Pessac Leongan, and then you've got, yeah, Bordeaux, where Regan's indicating there. So that's the city of Bordeaux. And if you want a city that has more issues with bridges and traffic and water than Auckland, Bordeaux would take the cake. They have been redoing their bridges across the river, and also redoing a lot of the streets within the city, because they're very much growing quicker than the infrastructure can actually cope with. And, you know, it's probably the only place in the world where I've tried to drive 1 kilometre and spent 45 minutes trying to do it. So it's a fantastic city, but one that's undergoing a lot of change. So when we look at the map, there is north and sort of slightly to the left of the city of Bordeaux there, we have the Médoc. And what we're actually going to do tonight is we'll start with the white wine, and then we'll start the tasting in Saint Estephe, so up in the northern part of the Médoc. And we're then going to work our way down through Pauillac, through Saint Julian, down to Margaux, and then we'll pass through the city and not far outside the city and out to Pessac. Now, Pessac, Graves, that area, when you're driving around Bordeaux, it's very much being gobbled up by the city itself now. So that's that side of the map there, and what we're looking at is referred to as the left bank. And the left bank is where we get Cabernet dominant wines, and you can see the Atlantic Ocean out to the left there. You can see the Gironde coming down, and this is old riverbeds and gravel that you're seeing there. And that, of course, gravel, particularly good for Cabernet Sauvignon, so it likes to get its roots down, and gravel suits it well. What we will talk about in a minute is a little bit the proximity to the river, because that's a characteristic that's very, very important in this year. And you can see there with the Medoc that over the right-hand side of the Medoc are going to be vineyards that fared very differently to those over to the right-hand side, which are a little bit more landlocked. Then for the last two wines, what we're going to do is jump over to the right bank, and we're going to go first of all to Pomerol and then to Saint-Emilion. And the right bank of Bordeaux is up on a plateau, and a plateau with underlying clay. So left bank gravels Cabernet, right bank clay Merlot. And when you get water issues, and there was a hydric stress issue at one point in this growing season, then water is retained in clay, and that's very, very important for getting the grapes physiologically ripe, is that they do have water at the right time. So north to south, left bank first, right bank second is essentially how we're going to taste. So before we continue with the slideshow there, Regan, what we might just do is talk a little bit about the vintage itself. And the first thing that's quite interesting with 2017 is, for some reason, and there is no logic at all to this, but vintages ending in the number 7 are historically vintages to avoid in Bordeaux. Never buy, apart from 2017, a vintage ending in a 7. And it was referred to as sort of the curse of the 7s. And, you know, on the backdrop of that, when very early, it was actually the 27th and 28th of April, there was devastating frosts in 2017. You know, everyone talked about the curse of a 7 vintages, because this is going to be another one that's going to be a disaster. But the frosts, they not only went through Bordeaux, but also other parts of France. And what did happen is they were very early on. So there were 2 paths that presented themselves to the producers. Because the frost was early, in some instances, the fruit did set again, and there was a second generation of fruit. So there was the first fruit that survived the frost, but it was reduced quantity. And then some of the vines produced a second generation of fruit. Now, generally, second generation fruit, we don't hear about a lot, because this level of frost damage is, you know, devastating, and fortunately we don't see as much that rips through vineyards like this did. But generally, second generation fruit is not considered as good as first. And probably no surprise that the producers that we're going to taste tonight, and certainly what we ended up importing, we're not talking about producers that did use second generation fruit, but certainly it did surprise me the number of properties that did. But anyway, so frost is something, you know, everyone talks about with 2017 and the curse of a 7 vintages. But, you know, like a lot of things, this vintage is about more than just one weather event. Because what happened after the frosts, and after there was an eventual fruit set, albeit in some instances quite small, there was a really hot period. And unfortunately, that hot period then went on longer than was ideal, and there was hydric stress. So we've got no fruit set, so bugger all grapes. Then we've got essentially drought conditions, and we ended up with hydric stress. And fortunately, there was a point where the rain did come, and it did provide the moisture that was required, and the Cabernet did get ripe, but not everywhere. And this is where, you know, when I was showing you the map before, I said this is a vintage where you can't look across it and make generalizations, because things like if the vineyard is close to the river, the impact of those frosts was less, because the frost will actually act as a thermal, the river will act as a thermal buffer, and the frost impact won't be as high. If there's a higher proportion of clay in the vineyard, and some of the vineyards on the left bank do have clay, particularly in Saint Estephe, and we're going to look at one tonight where this is relative. The vineyard parcels where there's clay, the hydric stress impact won't have been as high. You know, there's pockets of clay through something like Chateau Parma as well. So, you know, that's where, although Cabernet was favoured on the left-hand side and the hydric stress didn't favour the Merlot on the left, you then get Parma, who produced a higher percentage of Merlot in their crop. So I think the underlying thing for 17 is small harvest because of frost, really good concentration because of drought, and huge variability because it depended where you were situated, what your soil type was, and then came down to also the skill and technology. So it's a fascinating vintage when you put all of those characteristics together. If you had to put some generalizations over it, the right bank was more affected by frost than the left bank. So something like Puy-Blanc, they only produced 50% of their usual production. Chateau Grand Village, wonderful little property, they only made 9% of their usual production. Not 90, not 19, 9. So just one number in that number. So absolutely small. So then from all of those conditions, what do the wines actually taste like? Well, the key thing when tasting them is that it's a very, very pleasurable vintage to taste. These are very approachable wines when they're young. And I think you'll find that through these tonight. You know, I would imagine we'll be sitting there thinking, gosh, I could enjoy these right now. But they're also going to be really good wines to enjoy sort of with short-term cellaring. These aren't going to be the likes of 9, 10 or 15 or 16 and require time in the cellar. So in terms of the other aspects that I think are really relevant for this vintage, is when I tasted it, the conditions around en-primeur and around releasing these wines, and I think this is worth just touching on a little bit, is, you know, there was no expectation of this being a good vintage at all. It was going to be written off pretty much at the beginning. But when they worked out that actually it was a good vintage, and tasting very quickly showed that it was a good vintage, the nice thing with this year is that the producers did decide to actually show what I felt tasting it, a huge amount of respect for the market. And it's something that, you know, we're not that used to from the Bordelais, but I think they did in this year. The quality of the vintage, it's not 15 or 16. I think the wines, you know, you'll be really surprised by the quality tonight, but if you put them beside 15 or 16, I think they're probably better vintages for longer term aging. But it is better than 11, 12, 13 and 14. So price-wise, you know, it needed to sit above those, but it needed to sit under 15 and 16. And that's where it was priced. And I think a region that has enough respect for the market to actually release the wines in line with where the vintage is qualitatively needs to be shown the respect. The other thing to note with this vintage is this is not a vintage that the critics raved about, and that's actually a good thing, because this is a vintage where, I mean, having said that, we're going to look at some wines with some big scores tonight, but, you know, it's not a vintage that Parker wrote about or tasted. the producers are no longer trying to make wines to satisfy Parker. It follows on from 16, where we saw lower alcohols, really nice balance, and wines not being produced to chase critic scores, which is a return to a classic style of claret, which certainly in terms of how I like my Bordeaux, it suits me down to a T. So that's in a nutshell sort of the vintage conditions and what the 2017s are about. I think what we'll do is, it's about time we tasted one of them, and what we're going to do is move to Regan, who's going to talk to us about the first white wine there. So hand over to you, Regan.
All right, thanks, Liz. I think one thing I will say about Liz saying that the critic scores weren't particularly good. When the in-bottle scores came out, there was definitely an uptick in the scores really across the whole range. And when people taste in barrel, you obviously always give a range of scores, like, you know, generally between 3 or 4, say 90 to 93 or 90 to 94, that kind of range, because you never know exactly how it's going to turn out. And in most vintages, it tends to fall around about the middle of the range. Some vintages are quite highly lauded en primeur and barrel. And then when they come out, they tend to drop a little bit. They drop, you know, perhaps, you know, just below the average of that mid-range. Whereas from what we've seen with the 2017s, is almost everything has come in at the high end of its range. So if it was rated 90 to 93, you'd usually expect it to be a 91 or a 92, and it's come out at a 93. You know, in some cases, there's even been some things that have been bumped up to something like 94. So that's interesting to see. Maybe Liz will talk about that a little bit later on as we move through, that it is one of those vintages that I think for the tasters in Bordeaux for en primeur, I think it was a vintage where, having tasted 2015 and 2016, you know, and having those fresh in their mind, then moving to the 17s, perhaps they underscored them a little bit when they tasted them in barrel. When they tasted them again, you know, a year and a half later, just going into bottle, they're like, oh, okay, actually, these are a lot better than we thought they were. So that's interesting to see as we go through. Right. So we're going to start with a white wine, which I'm very excited about because I love white Bordeaux. And it is this beautiful wine right here. Hopefully you can all see that. Blanc de Lynch Bages. And you'll see it's appellation Bordeaux Control A. It's just a basic AOC Bordeaux white wine. Even though Lynch Bages, of course, is one of the most famous chateau names in Bordeaux, perhaps in the world as well. It's a 5th growth estate in the 1855 classification. But for a very, very long time, it's been producing wines probably relative to 2nd growth quality. But most people don't know that they actually make a white wine as well. Now, they're, of course, situated in Poliak on the left bank, but there is no Poliak designation for a white wine, which is why this is just a basic AOC. Oh, I think we've got somebody trying to come in here. Oh, yes. So somebody mentioning that they didn't know that the Lynch Bages Blanc was 70% Cabernet Sauvignon. Yes, I should have mentioned that. There is one wrong tasting note in the booklet. So there is no Cabernet Sauvignon in this wine, in case you're reading that tasting note. The rest of them are correct, I promise. Right. So I guess before we talk about it, let's start by giving it a taste. Wow, and that really is everything that I love about white Bordeaux. Now there's a beautiful picture of the chateau itself, so Lynch Bages. So we won't talk so much about Pauillac because we're going to talk about Pauillac as we move through, and this really isn't a Pauillac, it's a Bordeaux Blanc. But Lynch Bages, of course, is a chateau with a very, very long history. Now it was originally actually known as Chateau Bages. It takes its name from the area in which it's situated within Pauillac. And it's within the Bages kind of sub-region. And it was basically established somewhere between 1720 and 1728. So it's been around for a very, very long time. Now in 1749, the estate was bequeathed to the daughter of the owner, Elizabeth, and she was the wife of a man named Thomas Lynch. And that's how the estate really became into the ownership of the Lynch family, for where the name takes. They had it for about 75 years. but it was never actually known as Lynch Bages during that time period. Actually, when the 1855 classification happened and it was classified as a fifth growth, it was actually known as Chateau Julian Bages. That's what the wines were selling as. And it was because it was owned by a Swiss wine merchant, a guy called Sebastian Julian at the time. Now, it wasn't until 1862 it was sold to the Carew brothers, and they renamed it at that stage Chateau Lynch Bages in honor of the Lynch family who originally owned it. Now, it was the Cazars family, Jean-Charles Cazars, in 1930. He was in charge of, I think, Laurent de Pez at the time in Saint-Estephe. He agreed to basically lease the vines of Lynch Bages, and the Cazars family had a really long history in Bordeaux, going back to the 19th century. And he took up this agreement to lease the vines of Lynch Bages because he was really energetic, wanting to do it. The owner wasn't really interested in doing it. The vineyards had become kind of quite dilapidated at the time. Were in need of kind of some expensive replanting. But for Cazars, he had the energy to do it, but he lacked the funds to buy the vineyard itself. And he eventually purchased the property on the eve of the Second World War. And Lynch Bages and Laurent de Pez have been run by the Cazars family since then. So they still have ownership of it. They kind of expanded the vineyards around about 1970. So you can see here's Poliak. You can see the Hollande River coming down there. And Lynch Bages is kind of right in the heart of it here, not too far from the river. You'd say they're in the southern portion of Pauillac, but you can see they've got some wonderful neighbors kind of all the way around them there. Now, Jean-Charles's son, Jean-Michel Cazars, he took over the estate around about 1973 and really started to kind of modernize everything that we see at the estate. He put a new vat room in, insulated the buildings, built these storage cellars that we see here in front of us, restored all the loading areas, the wine storehouses, and he was basically the unofficial ambassador for Bordeaux for a very, very long time. Jean-Michel Caz was the man kind of for Bordeaux because he met more people, he traveled kind of more often, promoted his wines across the world like no other owner. And that's kind of how Lynch Bages kind of became so well known, because they were a fifth growth, but he was investing so much money into the winery. The quality was rising every single year, but also everyone was meeting him all over the world at all the best kind of places, tasting his wine. I think he was one of the very first chateau owners to start promoting their wine in China in 1986. So it's still particularly well known in China to this day. And I found out a very interesting fact when we were reading about this, that Lynch Bages actually became the very first wine that was ever sent into space. Apparently a French astronaut carried a bottle of the 1975 Lynch Bages on the joint American and French space flight. Now, in 1987, he joined the team at AXA Insurance, who were, or AXA Lisme, and they decided that they wanted to build an investment portfolio of high quality vineyards around the world. And Lynch Bages was one of the first to kind of get integrated into that. So he was named director of the wine division for all of AXA, including Pichon Baron as well. So you will have met kind of one of the guys from that at the Pichon Baron dinner for you guys who came to the French Cafe for that particular dinner. And it's just got better and better since that time, more and more investment as they've started investing in all of these kind of different estates. And that's kind of the classic photo we see there in the vineyard of Lynch Bages and the cellar house at the back there. So I'll stop this sharing now. Hopefully you guys can see me again there. Right, so we won't really talk too much about what Lynch Bages kind of does for their red wine. What we want to know is what they do for their white wine. And they've got about 100 hectares of vineyards there. The plantings are about 75% Cabernet, 17% Merlot, 6% Cab Franc, 2% Petit Verdot. But what they also have is 6 hectares of vines that are reserved just for the production of this wine, of Lynch Bages Blanc. And those are just to the kind of the west of the estate. And their plantings are predominantly Sauvignon Blanc. So it's about 53% Sav, 32% Semillon, and 15% Muscadel. And some reasonably old vines. I think they average 20 to 25 years of age. And the very first vintage of this wine was 1990. So it hasn't been around for a huge amount of time. I think, Liz, the first vintage we bought in was only maybe the 2011. We hadn't seen it for some years before that, because I remember buying some of those 2010 or 2011, and I haven't opened any of them yet. I put them aside.
Yeah, it would have been around that. So, yeah, the Muscadel is particularly high in this year, and that's because it really liked the conditions in this year, and I think it gives a really interesting characteristic to the wine.
Yeah, definitely. If we look at kind of the way this wine is usually made, that's a good point that Liz said. This wine is a little bit different to how it normally is. So the way it's normally made is it's generally vinified in a combination of around about 50% new oak, 20% in 1-year-old barrels, and the remaining 30% is vinified in really large vats. So not all of it in barrel. It's aged on the lees for about 6 months. But this particular vintage is a little bit different. So because of the frost, they lost quite a bit of Sauvignon Blanc. So usually this wine is Sauvignon Blanc predominant, but it's not in this particular vintage. It's actually primarily Semillon. I think this year it's 41% Semillon, 40% Sav, 19% Muscadel. So there's a bit more Muscadel than normal, and there's quite a bit more Semillon than there is normally in the blend. And I think this year, 45% of the wood was new in this. So this has a significant whack of kind of new wood in it. And looking at kind of some of the tasting notes out there for this, they kind of vary between people who don't usually like Lynch Bages Blanc because they're more Semillon fans. So they don't like the primarily Sauvignon Blanc regular version of it. And so they love this particular vintage. And then you've got some who are like, well, it's not a classic Lynch Bages Blanc. And it's not a classic Lynch Bages Blanc because it's not like a Grave style that's mostly Semillon. But I really like this particular year for it. I'm a bit of a Semillon fan, and it doesn't have so much Sem that we're looking at a Grave kind of type style. I think the balance of the Sem and the Sav here is just beautiful, with that Muscadel bringing out all of those extra kind of flavors as well. I love this.
It's also the alcohol in it, Regan's relatively low. So if you want to be very exact, it's 12.98.
Wow.
But, you know, that for an alcohol is reasonably low. And I think the thing that I really like is there's that lime rind character to it and a crunchy nature to the acidity, which a lot of that's coming from the Semillon, but it just gives this wine an extra dimension that, you know, I'd sit in the camp of, I prefer this style to the normal Lynch Blanc.
Agreed. I think I feel the same way. I think this is my favorite one that I've had. It was very, very good.
Yeah.
So in terms of aging this, especially with more Sem in it, I mean, I think no problem, 20 years on this bottle, I think easily.
Yeah, definitely.
And probably a little bit too early to drink, but like, I don't mind drinking that right now either. I don't think the acidity is so pronounced, or the oak is so pronounced that you actually need to leave it. I'd be happy to drink some of that, but you can put it aside if you like the older style. Any fans of that particular wine out there? If you want to make any comments on anything, just you can ask questions on the chat, and we can kind of, Liz or I can pass it forward to whoever's presenting, or if you want to unmute yourself and make a comment on the wine, go right ahead. So Anne-Marie loves it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good, isn't it? It's a really good example of a white Bordeaux. And I think, you know, as you said, Regan, on the aging of this wine as well, you know, white Bordeaux can age for a very, very long time, and old white Bordeaux is just, it's another whole world. Magnificent. Very good.
Fantastic.
Shall we move to the red, the first red, yes? Okay, cool. So the very first red we've got is, we're moving to Saint Estephe and moving to Calon Segur. So wonderful place to start, and this is the northernmost classified vineyard in the Medoc, and a walled vineyard, and there's a lovely picture there of the label. And the history of Calon Segur actually dates back to 1147, so it's a contender for one of the oldest in Saint Estephe. And actually, while we've got the label up there, a wonderful story about that is the name on Segur actually comes from Alexander de Segur, and he was a prominent figure in the early days in Bordeaux, and that was predominantly because he owned Chateau Latour and Chateau Lafitte. So he had Latour Lafitte and this other property, Calon, and he very famously said, "I make my wine at Lafitte and Latour, but my heart is at Calon." And that's why to this day there's a heart on the label there. So that's where that comes from. In terms of the estate itself, really interesting. If you go back and look, 1825 Montrose, which is up in Saint Estephe as well, that was actually a forest and was owned by Calon Segur. Calon Segur was also part of the estate at that stage, and the estate was so large that part of the entire Segur estate actually later became Lafitte, Latour, and even part of Mouton. So as they divided it all up, it was such a predominant estate in those early days. Little parts of it became parts of these other great chateaux today. Moving forward just a little bit though, in fact quite a lot, to 2012. It was owned until then by the Gaston family, and Madame passed away in 2012, actually 2011 I think she passed away, aged 87, and Chateau Calon Segur was sold at that stage. It was sold for 170 million euros. And it was a French insurance company that bought the predominant holding in it, with a minority stake in it going to Jean-Pierre Moeks. So Jean-Pierre Moeks, the Moeks family, and the negotiant on the right bank, and they purchased a minority shareholding at the same time, and that certainly has helped them with their allocations of this property. And inadvertently helps us because we buy a lot with them. They're a very important partner. So the French insurance company that purchased them, they then renovated it, and it was completed in 2011, and the renovation cost an impressive 20 million euro. So you buy an investment for 170 million, only to turn around and promptly spend 20 million. Now what they did with the renovation is they actually replaced all of the old vats, and they replaced them with stainless steel, and really revigorated the entire property. And putting in all these stainless steel vats, what they did is there's actually 70 of them, the majority of which are conical vats, but the 70 are perfectly matched to the vineyard parcels and the capacity that will come off each of the parcels. So they vinify the 70 different parcels of what they pick separately, and they have a vat for each of the different parcels that comes in. There's a wonderful photo of the Walled Vineyard. It really is a walled vineyard, and there's a great shot of it there. So it's a 55 hectare estate in total. As we said, it's in Saint Estephe, so right up in the northern part there. Interesting, when they took it over, the vine density was 8,000. Vines per hectare, and they actually are undergoing a mission to increase the vine density, and they're aiming to get it to 10,000 vines per hectare. So vine density, increasing that is going to, one of the things it's going to do is push the roots deeper, and have them go searching for some nutrients a little bit deeper in the soil, but also the competition for the vine is going to be good because it tends to produce better berries when it's under a little bit of stress. In doing that, in the replanting, there are some young vines here, and the average vine age has dramatically dropped since they've started doing their new planting. The vineyards here, in terms of the soil, you've got a combination of the lovely gravels that you tend to get on the left bank, but also they do have, as I said before, some parcels that are clay. and that's very unique in Saint Estephe, and it's unique to Calon Segur. So this is why things like their Merlot percentage in the 2017 is not too different to what they normally do, because they have their Merlot growing on these little pockets of clay that they have. So the vine age has actually dropped to 25 years as the average vine age, which is, you know, we'd be excited by 25 years vine age here in New Zealand, but relatively in Bordeaux, that is a little bit lower. Under the new management, and you can see it there, they have gone to more new oak. So it's now between 90 to 100% new oak used in Calon Segur, and this has really changed the style of it. So before we go on to have a taste of the wine, I had a quick smell before, and I must admit you can get the new oak on it. Well, I always love the purity with Calon Segur, and there's this lovely sort of aromatic nature that they get with their Cabernet, which is brilliant. In terms of a blend this year, 76% Cabernet, 13% Merlot, 9% Cabernet Franc, and 2% Petit Verdot. For those interested, it's got a pH of 3.7 and it has an ABV of 13.2%. Very exact tonight with my alcohols. And actually their harvest lasted from the 15th to the 29th of September. And the lovely thing with that, and it's obviously our first red wine tonight, is it's showing you really well the vintage conditions, because the concentration of the fruit is there, but it's not heavy. They're very approachable, very attractive wines, and this is a great place to start, I think. What do you think, Regan?
Yeah, I've always been a huge fan of Calon Segur. I think it's one of the kind of the best wines in the region for one of the lowest prices. It's always been significantly, I think, underpriced compared to its peers. So it's one that I've bought a few bottles of over the years, both kind of for cellaring myself, and you find the occasional bottle of this in restaurants as well. And it's a very good price. I think we actually had we had a bottle of this in Macau of the 1990 last year, which was just like absolute perfect drinking. And you can see in this that classic tannin structure of Saint Estephe as well, which is one of the reasons I really like it. I think Saint Estephe and Calon Segur is like a really kind of favorite steak Bordeaux wine for me, because it's got those big grippy tannins. You're never going to find super fine tannins in a Calon Segur. It always has tannins that are a little bit larger, a little bit more, you know, kind of structured in its tannins. You know, it's always got a bit of beef to it. But you can see from this, I mean, just how approachable some of these wines are going to be tonight. I mean, I've still got some 96 and 95 Calon Segur I brought from Glengarry a very, very long time ago, and I haven't touched those wines because you're going to need 40 years. And I think the style of a lot of the estates is starting to get a little bit more approachable. And then when you hit a slightly more approachable style with a vintage like this, you get a wine like this that I'd be happy to drink that with dinner tonight, you know, but you're still going to be able to cellar it.
Yeah, that's the great thing with these, is just that approachability. Interesting, it's 100% new oak. So they've moved to between 90 and 100. That's actually 100%, and you taste that, and yeah, you can taste the oak, but gosh, you don't taste that it's 100%, and that shows you that concentration and ripeness that fruit must have got to be able to handle all that new oak. And
I can't believe that's 100% new oak, Liz. Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's incredible. I think the other thing with it is, you know, we talk about that sort of hydric stress and the drought conditions that occurred in this vintage. There's a freshness to the wines. They're not heavy. You know, they don't taste like they've been sort of baked in the sun or cooked in a hot vintage. And there was a real risk of that in this year. So I think the balance, yeah, it's brilliant. Very unusual. Cool. Should we move on to the next wine, Regan? Over to you.
Better unmute myself first. Right, so the next area we're going to be looking at is Pauillac. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Pauillac before we kind of look at the wines. And Pauillac really is the quintessential Bordeaux wine. I think when people think about Bordeaux, what they're really thinking about is Pauillac. It has that balance of kind of nobility, of power, of refinement, of finesse, huge aging capacity. I mean, a great Poliak from one of the first growths from a great vintage is 100-year wine. Now, I think one of the other reasons why it's so famous is out of the 5 first growths in Bordeaux, 3 of them are in this appellation. So you've got Chateau Lafitte Rothschild, Mouton Rothschild, and Chateau Latour. So 3 of the first growths, and you've got 2 of the second growths in Pauillac as well. So of course, Chateau Pichon Baron, and the one we've got here tonight, Chateau Pichon Lalande de Comtesse de Lalande, or that mouthful, or Chateau Pichon Lalande, as most people would normally call it. Now, there's only, I think, a few Cru Bourgeois kind of estates in here, but there's quite a few 5th growth estates in here as well, of course. Lynch Bages, one of them being in here. The other probably most famous 5th growth from Pauillac would be Chateau Pontet-Canet as well, being there. Now, the history kind of this region, the vineyards were mostly planted in Pauillac around this kind of the second half of the 13th century, but it wasn't until the 1500s and the 1700s when a lot of planting started to happen. And that was when the Dutch engineers got in there and started to drain the swamps of the Medoc. And once they drained those swamps, the cultivation of this area like took off all through the kind of the 18th century, especially. And one of the major reasons why Pauillac kind of really exploded was it's right alongside the Gironde River there. So you had that, that proximity to all the local ports in the left bank there. Ease of shipping, of course, when you've got all of these barrels, you know, kind of horses and wagons needed to be moving. And so you had all of these different kind of little cities set up alongside the water there. And so that's how Pauillac became the largest city kind of in the Medoc, north of Bordeaux city as well. Now, of course, the soil here is the other important thing about Pauillac. Very, very deep river gravels right alongside the Gironde as well. So you've got deep gravels, really good for Cabernet Sauvignon, really good for drawing up water from very, very low down. And in wet years as well, really, really good for drainage. It's also quite warm. And when you're down close to the river as well, as Liz said in her introduction, a lot of protection from frost in this particular region as well. So you've got really deep vines in this kind of region. Right, let's bring up this next one. And we're looking at here what really is one of the greatest wines in Bordeaux. And that, of course, is Chateau Pichon Lalande. Hopefully we'll get that slide up here. There we go. Beautiful label as well. And that is the full name, Chateau Pichon Lalande, Comtesse de Lalande. But you'll find that most people will abbreviate it to Chateau Pichon Lalande, or sometimes Chateau Pichon Lalande, depending on who you're talking to. And yes, it is associated with Pichon Baron. They both originally were one single estate. And they were split up in 1850, where Baron Joseph de Pichon Lalande divided the property between his 5 children. And he tried to think of a way of dividing it equally. So he had 2 sons and 3 daughters. So his 2 sons received 2/5 of the vineyard and received the cellars of the vineyard as well. And his 3 daughters, of course, got the other 3/5. And the estate was kind of officially broken up, and they became kind of 2 separate identities as well. And certainly with the sons taking Pichon Baron and the daughters taking Pichon Lalande, we've kind of seen that over the years in the style of the 2 wines as well, with one being a little bit more structured, a little bit richer, a little bit more powerful, and Pichon Lalande being perhaps the prettier of the 2, a little bit more finesse, a little bit more elegance. Right, so before we go any further, I think we need to taste it. So glass number 3, Pichon Lalande. Wow, and you can see straight away the difference in style between Saint Estephe and Poliak, and you can see why Poliak is held in such high regard. Just the nobility and the kind of that aristocratic nature of that wine, combining that power, combining that elegance at the same time. Massive amounts of richness there. There's huge tannin in that, but you can see how fine the tannins are compared to the larger kind of grippier tannins that we see up in Saint Estephe. Now, this estate has been managed throughout the centuries by various sets of women, starting with the Comtesse de Lalande herself, the wife of the Count de Lalande. And they never had any heirs. All of the women through the various centuries on the estate, it tended to get passed down from aunts to kind of nieces until it was sold in 1925. And you can see here, it's very much right down in the southern part of the appellation down here. It's probably the warmest microclimate of the appellation. Pichon Lalande, of course, directly across the road. Of course, they were both part of one originally large estate. And the closest vineyard to them, of course, is Chateau Latour. And you'll see when we look at it, I don't think we can see it in the next picture here, but the building itself, which is one of the most beautiful chateaux in all of Bordeaux, that chateau, that is actually situated within the larger vineyard of Chateau Latour. So all the vines surrounding it don't actually belong to Pichon Lalande at all. They belong to Chateau Latour. So it's quite an interesting positioning. They don't actually have any of their vines just in there. Now, it originally started off at about 40 hectares and it's up at about 90 hectares of vines. So that's quite an accomplishment to grow a left bank estate by almost 50%, kind of since 1855. And it's remained in the hands of the same family for over 250 years. So very, very impressive. Over the 3 centuries, only 2 separate families have ever owned Pichon Lalande. Now, it was sold to the owners of Roederer Champagne in 2007. And they still own it to this day. So they're the 3rd owner. And 2008, they did a complete renovation of the estate all the way through. All the winemaking facilities completely rebuilt, completely modernized, work in the cellars, work in the vat rooms, work in the chai. And you can see they spent a huge amount of money in the Grand Chai there, like many estates have in Bordeaux over the last 20 years. Really strong targeted replanting program as well, making sure they had all the best root stocks with all the best potential Marcel selection. So taking the best vines from within the vineyard, taking cuttings, replanting them, propagating them. So they're not just buying in vines of the same clone. So they've got clonal variation throughout the vineyard. Now, the last time it was renovated was in 2012, and they spent somewhere between, again, 15 to 20 million euros to renovate the property. They put in a huge amount of work into the cellars as well. I think they put in a triple tiered cellar, so everything moving by gravity, all new temperature controlled double skin vats, so they can now vinify absolutely parcel by parcel as they work through. So they don't have to blend anything until they get to the final stage. They can do all the vinifications of the different parcels within the vineyard by themselves. Of course, they're also as green as possible as well. Now, the vineyards that we can see there, currently planted to 61% Cabernet Sauvignon, 32% Merlot, 4% Franc, and 3% Petit Verdot. And this is a really marked increase in Cabernet Sauvignon for the estate. For decades, the Cabernet used to only be about 45%. So that's a big jump going from 45% to 61%. And there is much less Petit Verdot planted in the vineyard as well. It used to be always around about 8%. Now it's down at only 3%. So they're definitely making some changes over the last 10 years at Pichon Lalande. Now, as we said, with the soils, very, very deep gravels, clay and limestone soils, right across from Pichon Baron. Just those vines that we actually see in that picture there are Chateau Latour's vines, as I said, not actually Pichon Lalande's. Now, they've got a 1 hectare parcel, I think, in that section there. But the heart of the vineyard is a 65 hectare parcel of vines that's quite close to the chateau on the other side of the road there, and very, very old vines. The average age of them is 45 years of age. Now that's the average age, remember. They've got some very, very old vines planted in the early 1930s. So we're looking at, 90 plus years of age for some of the vines there. So 45 years of age is a very, very old average age for Bordeaux. You won't find many estates with vines kind of that old. Now, one interesting thing about the vineyard as well is that they've got another block up in St. Julian. They've actually got 11 hectares that's actually within the St. Julian appellation that they're allowed to vinify as Poliak. So it's at time to time, apparently that particular wine has been bottled and sold by negociants as a St. Julian. And they do a mention of the vine's owners, Pichon Lalande, on the particular label. And a few decades ago, it wasn't unusual to see that wine bottled as both AOC St. Julian and AOC Poliak, depending on which negociant it was coming from. They stopped that kind of in the late 1960s, 1970s, I think. And they've got 1 hectare of those vines that's actually in St. Julian that only produces a wine that's offered to employees of Pichon Lalande. So they can use that for the employees, and they can also put that either into the Grand Vin or into the second wine as well. So it's pretty unusual that, that they've actually got vines in another appellation. Okay, hopefully you guys can see me again there. Now the wine itself, this is one of the most kind of sensuous wines in all of Bordeaux. If you came to the second growth tasting that I hosted last year, and we tasted the 2016, this wine was off the charts in 2016 as well. Absolutely loved it. And it's one of the highest scoring wines, I think, that we've got here tonight. I think 96 from Wine Advocate, from Spectator, from Decanter. Really, really beautiful wine. Someone's saying a classic Pauillac in there, and I would absolutely agree with that. It's got all of those kind of cigar box characters in there, those pencil lead, the kind of graphite that we like to see in a really, really nice Pauillac. Now this vintage, 70% Cabernet Sauvignon in 2017, which is more Cabernet than they have planted in the vineyards, obviously. So they really rated their Cabernet this vintage. 23% Merlot, 6% Cabernet Franc, and 1% Petit Verdot. Now, I think this year it spent 18 months and 60% new oak. So this actually doesn't have as much new oak as we saw before in the Calon Segur. So it's really, it's hard to tell by tasting a wine exactly what it's got in it. It depends on how they've made it. But this is just such a classy wine. And I think they only used 50% of the production this year of their total production went into the Grand Vin. The rest of it was all kind of declassified. So, I mean, it's pretty difficult to compare between the two when you're trying Pichon Baron, Pichon Lalande for quality. It really comes down to personal preference. For a long time, I thought that I preferred Pichon Baron. I really liked that, that masculine nature of it, where it was really powerful, really rich, really deep, kind of an over-the-top Poliak a little bit, maybe a little bit more New World. But the more times I have Lalande, the more I love this wine. It's the Chateau Margaux of Poliak, I think would be a good way of describing it. It has all of the elegance and all of the finesse, but that doesn't come at the expense of concentration or intensity. Awesome wine.
Yeah, interesting, I think as well, Regan, with this one. So just looking at the vintage conditions in relationship to it, is you talked about Poliak, where it is in relation to the river. And certainly where Pishon is, they're right down there, or you can see the river from the tasting room. They had very little frost damage. They lost one vineyard, which was right sort of up the back, and that's why there's a little bit less Merlot. But overall, they were at 36 hectolitres per hectare. And if you compare that to a 2016 vintage, that was at 40. So not a huge reduction in the actual yields for them, but the selection criteria for them is always very tough in terms of what goes in the Grand Vin. Yeah. Excellent. Cool. Very, very good wine.
Very good wine.
We go to the next one.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so guys, what we're going to do now is go to glass number 4. And we're now moving to Chateau Leoville Barton and moving to St. Julian, and Regan will give us some lovely images there of this. So there's a lot of properties where we get the name Leoville in them. There's Leoville Barton, Leoville Lascaux, Leoville Porphyry, and they were all part originally of the same big St. Julian estate. So there was one big estate that actually encompassed all of these properties. The Barton family themselves, they can actually trace their history back to 1722, and it was Thomas Barton who actually came from Ireland, and like a lot of people coming to Bordeaux at around that time, started a negotiant business. And Barton and Goustier, it still exists today, but that was the negotiant business that he established. And just a negotiant, just briefly to stop on that, I'm sure everyone knows the setup, but just in case anyone doesn't, Bordeaux is very unique in the way that wines are sold. So wines are actually, the chateaux sell to a courtier. This is a very brief version of it. A chateau sells to a courtier, so a middleman sells to a negotiant then distributes around the world. So the negotiants sell. So because you can end up with lots of different negotiants selling the wine, it's an open market situation. So the prices are relative, but when the wines are released, particularly on Premier, the price is pretty stable. You know, you very rarely get one negotiant offering it any different to the next, because also the way the courtiers sell is they, in a way, fix the price, so it goes out at the same thing. What's quite interesting with it is there's a lot of criticism of the negotiant system and also of En Primeur itself. But when you look at something like the situation that we now find ourselves in, where globally the ability to sell for a lot of estates their top wines is reduced, the negotiant system is actually becoming more and more relevant, because there's a lot of top estates, top Italian estates, American, and actually for the first time this year, a lot of Australian wineries that are looking to the Bordelais to access premium markets around the world and distribute for them. So it's a fascinating system. Anyway, back to Leoville Barton. So Thomas Barton arrived and he set up a negotiant. Leoville Barton then, in terms of how that came out of this massive property that encompassed all three of them, is it was actually a part of Leoville Lascaux that was chopped off to become Leoville Barton. And when that happened, it was the vineyard assets themselves that were chopped off, not a cellar or a chateau. So in fact, to this day, Leoville Barton is one of the very few in Bordeaux that actually doesn't have a chateau associated with it. And what you're looking at there is actually, I believe, the back of Leoville Lascaux, because Leoville Barton's vineyards used to be Lascaux. And, you know, if you go to visit Leoville Barton, you know, the only thing you can sort of vaguely go near is Lascaux. The wines themselves are made at Langoa Barton, and that actually continues today, that the two estates are actually vinified there. So it's very unique from that point of view.
Interesting thing there, Liz, is that that picture there, that the famous picture of the gates at Leoville Barton, that's actually Langoa Barton. So there isn't really a Leoville Barton that you can go and visit as such. It's vineyards that make wine at somewhere else, you know. But so it's a bit of a strange hangover. But people look for Leoville Barton and they can't find it.
It's a huge oxymoron, because, you know, everywhere else has a chateau, and it says chateau on the label, and it should be there, but it's not there. Anyway, 51 hectares of vineyards, so reasonably large vineyard property there. Gravel subsoil on top of some clay, so they do have some clay here. And it's got an average vine age of 30 years, But with this property as well, 60-year-old vine age for the Merlot. And I didn't mention before, but one of the other characters or sort of conditions to think about in this year is if you had very old vines and they had their roots well established, they will have been able to sustain the hydric stress a little bit better than young vines. So it's such a fascinating vintage. You can tell there's just so much to take into consideration. 9,000 vines per hectare. So we talked with Calon Segur about them wanting to increase to 10,000 vines per hectare. These guys are sort of already sitting at that higher end. And 50% of what they do is organic, not certified, but they now are 50% of their production is coming off organically managed vineyards, and they are definitely heading towards being organic. Interestingly, they don't do a green harvest. So they don't go through the vineyards when the grapes are green and drop some of the fruit to control the yield. What they actually do is their pruning is very specific, and they control their yield through their pruning. 200 hectolitre wooden vats for fermentation. So talk to Calon Segur about them pulling out all the old vats and putting in lots of stainless steel and all sorts of different sizes to match the different plots. So very modern approach to the new look of Calon Segur, whereas at Leoville it's still quite sort of old school, if you like, in terms of how they're approaching it. Having said that, they co-inoculate. So they will inoculate with yeast for the alcoholic fermentation at the same time as the malolactic fermentation. So it will go through the alcoholic fermentation, and then the malolactic fermentation will go straight after. That does prevent any risk in terms of the wine sitting between the two fermentations. Really odd fact, up until 2010, they used only one supplier for barrels. So it was very, in terms of their aging, it was quite harmonious in terms of the oak. They've now changed to 4 different suppliers. So, you know, they're developing and progressing a little bit, but very slowly. 20 months in oak. So also, you know, a whole lot of, I think, what we're going to see with this wine is very traditional. So let's have a look at it if you haven't had a look yet. Yeah, so what I think you definitely also will see with this for Saint Julian is, you know, you always get a sort of pencil-led character, but also an ethereal nature and a savoury aspect to Saint Julian, and this should show that very well. Yeah, it's got that real sort of savoury aspect and that slightly linear nature which you get with Saint Julian. There's a taut characteristic to it. You could, I mean, it's fascinating, you know, we've gone from Saint Estephe to Pauillac and now Saint Julian, and you can see just how different each of the different appellations are. 93% Cabernet, 7% Merlot. It is 13% ABV and 60% new French oak, which was it was aged in for 20 months. So again, you know, reasonable amount of oak and nice long aging there. So the vinification was in those old wood vats that we saw before there, and then the élevage was in the new French oak.
Loving the lower alcohols in these, Liz.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
Yeah, and like you said, they've all got so much freshness to them as well. Like it's not a vintage that's, you know, missing that. Like it's a little bit perhaps lighter, you know, it doesn't have the concentration, but, you know, is a bit stodgy. It's not at all.
Yeah, it's really good. I think also, you know, just going back to the difference between the 3 wines and how we can very clearly see a sense of place and where they've come from, you know, and I don't want to sound overly critical, but in some of those vintages where they were chasing Parker scores and they were chasing high alcohols and, you know, lots of fruit, you did end up with, I think, sadly, some of the characteristics of the place being lost. And, you know, in these wines, and we saw it last year in the 16s, they represent much more a sense of place than being a Bordeaux that's been crafted to someone's style. And yeah, I like it.
They're delicious.
Cool. So what we need to do now, guys, is we're going to move on to flight 2. So we'll give you just a couple of minutes to empty your glasses if you're going to do that, or whatever you're going to do, and then pour 4 more wines, and Regan will talk us through the first one of those. I'm going to be very nice and stand up and take these to the kitchen and give these 4 glasses to my husband and get 4 more glasses.
How nice of you.
Fortunately, we've got enough glasses at home, but I can't bear to tip them out. That would just be too much of a waste.
Right, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes to do that, and if you need to go to the bathroom or anything, then we'll kick off again in about 2 minutes. All right, hopefully everybody has 4 glasses poured in front of them. And if you just have a quick smell through those, you'll see that this is going to be a very, very exciting flight. Often when I do these tastings, I start on the right bank and finish on the left bank. But in this particular vintage, looking at some of the tasting notes and kind of some of the results over there, I thought this is a vintage we want to finish in Pomerol and Saint-Emilion, because there's some incredible wines come out of there. Even though there's not very much wine come out of there, the quality of them is pretty amazing. But we're still going to continue with our last wine on the left bank before we get down to Bordeaux City. And that, of course, is Chateau Rauzan Segla from Margaux. And Margaux has always been one of my favorite appellations in Bordeaux. It's one of the oldest appellations in Bordeaux. They think that it was the very first area in Bordeaux that was cultivated for vineyards by the Romans somewhere around 2,000 years ago. The famous Roman poet Ausonius, he poetically called this particular region Marigiala. And there is a Chateau Marigiala in Bordeaux to this day that takes the name from it. Now, one thing with Bordeaux, certainly with the 1855 classification, is it has a huge amount of classified estates here. So there's 21 chateaux in Margaux that were included in that 1855 classification. And at the top of the tree, of course, is the only chateau that has the same name as the appellation. And that, of course, is the first growth Chateau Margaux, which is just one of the greatest wines in the world, and certainly one of my favorites. So they've got a first growth, one first growth in Margaux, but they have 5 second growths in this region. They have 10 third growths, 4 fourth growths, and 2 fifth growths. So there's a huge amount of classified estates here. But the funny thing is that this is a region that was kind of perennially known as an underachiever for a very, very long time. When the vintage conditions were right, the wines from Margaux were incredible. But it wasn't consistent across the whole appellation. There was a few great estates at the top that always performed, and really the 2 standout estates here are always Chateau Margaux and Chateau Parma. But beneath that, it was pretty variable depending on the vintage. That's all changed really in the last 20 years, and Margaux now is probably making the best wines they've ever made in the centuries that they've been there. Now, style-wise, Margaux is most known for its beautiful perfume, the elegance of the wine, the finesse of the wines. These are never blockbusters. These are always very, very pretty. Again, we've got some really deep gravels here. We've got elevations from the river ranging from about 1 meter above sea level up to about 30 meters above sea level. And again, very, very deep gravel soils here. And some quite heavy clay deposits around this appellation as well. And you've got not very much depth of soil in Margaux. So that allows, because the soils aren't deep, it allows them to heat up a lot faster. And it's also the most southern of the major appellations in the Medoc. So it's also a bit warmer. So what that means is this is the warmest area in the Medoc, and it's usually the first area in the Medoc to get harvested almost all of the time as well. So that's why some of the estates traditionally in this appellation didn't actually do so well in the really, really hot, really dry drought years because it just got too warm here. Now, again, very, very much a Cabernet dominant area. And the estate we're looking at here, Rauzan Segla, really made a wine for contender for some of the top wines out of the appellation this year. So let's have a look at that. And that's the new label for Rauzan Segla, I think, as of this year, as of 2017, that's the new label. So that's glass number 1. So let's give that a taste. You'll see straight away that beautiful perfume on the nose that always comes from a great Margaux.
Regan, it's really interesting. It's got a different shape to the wine. And I think if you think back to that St. Julian, and I know, some really interesting literature actually about looking at wine in terms of shapes and colors and, another sort of interesting way to look at it. But if you think in your mind that St. Julian as being very driven and focused, and you think about this one, it has a rounder, the texture is very different on your palate.
Yeah, very, very different, but so fine. Like it's, like you said, it's voluminous. Yeah, it's voluminous, it's shapely, but without being heavy. It's very, very light on the palate, even though it has all of the shape to it. Now, the history of this estate is very, very old. It dates back to somewhere around 1661. And you'll see where they are there, almost right in the very, very center of the appellation. Now, in 1661, September 7th, in fact, a guy called Pierre de Rauzan, he became the new owner of the noble house of Gassis, which essentially we're talking about Rauzan Segla, and you can see right next to it on the map there, Rauzan Gassis. Again, they were once one kind of grand estate. And he was very, very well versed in the world of Bordeaux when he joined the estate in 1661. He was already the manager at Chateau Margaux, and he remained there for another 2 years before joining Rauzan Segla full-time. He ended up returning to Chateau Margaux later, and he also maintained the same responsibilities at Chateau Latour, and he also purchased some of the vineyards that make up Pichon Lalande and Pichon Baron around this time as well. So he was a very, very influential man in the world of Bordeaux at the time. And when he died in 1692, his 3 sons shared the family holdings that they had there in Margaux, and the Poliak properties passed to his youngest daughter, Therese. And so after that, with the daughter and the son getting the different properties, they started to be Rauzan Segla and Rauzan Gassis were separated in the early 18th century. Now, by the end of the 18th century, the wines of Rauzan Segla were famous all over the world. This was one of the estates that Thomas Jefferson visited during his famous visit to Bordeaux in 1787. He bought quite a bit of Chateau Margaux, and he also ordered 10 cases of Rauzan Segla when he visited in 1787. And he declared at that stage that Rauzan Segla was at the top of the second growths in all of Bordeaux. So it was very, very highly rated back then. Now, it belonged to the same family for almost 2 centuries. Beautiful chateau when you look at that building, wonderful grounds. Now, it was sold in 1866 for 730,000 francs, which was a vast kind of sum at the time. And a man called Frederick Cruz took over the property, and he deserves the credit for building this beautiful chateau that we see here. And he completed the construction of that chateau in 1904. And it was the Cruz family who changed the spelling of the name. So originally it was Rauzan Segla with a Z, and they changed it to Rauzan Segla with an S. And so if you've ever got confused about what the difference is between Rauzan Segla and Rauzan Segla, they're exactly the same estate. So it actually had Rauzan with an S on the label, somewhere from around about the early 20th century, all the way through, I think, until 1994. And in 1994, the new owners reverted the spelling back to the original Z. So you can find older bottles out there with the S on the label. Now, the modern era of the estate really took off around about 1983, 1984, when they hired Professor Emile Pignard as the consulting enologist there. And they did an extensive renovation kind of through 1986, 1987, being one of the most modern kind of state-of-the-art wineries in all of Margaux. New stainless steel fermentation vats, new modernized cellars. And that's because it was sold to the Wertheimer brothers, and they are the owners of Chanel. And they still own it to this day. So Chanel actually owns Rauzan Segla. They did a full renovation, returned the original name back again, finished the restoration in 1996. They had Chanel's top architect, Peter Marino, who does all the Chanel buildings around the world. He renovated the chateau, put a new chai and everything in there, replaced all of the really old large tanks that they had in there by all these smaller capacity vats. And they have exactly the same number of vats as they have separate parcels in the vineyard, so that they can vinify each of the parcels separately, parcel by parcel vinification. And that was actually a design fault in the original cellars there. And they flooded when there was heavy rains and the water table from the river got too high. And so they actually needed, they had huge flood damage at one stage, and they needed about 3 years to dry out the cellars before they could completely rebuild them, because they just got so wet during this huge flood. Now, they also started taking on a bit more of a organic approach. They planted a lot more Petit Verdot in the vineyard, and they started using Shire horses to farm the vineyard. So this is one of the first 2 horses that they got. I'm not sure if this is Lionel or Titus, but they're both extremely fond of apparently carrots, apples and grapes. So it's the 3rd one I think they need to watch out for, because when they are tilling the vineyards there, apparently the horses don't mind kind of just bending down and taking a whole bunch off the vine and eating it themselves. So very interesting that that they've been doing that for quite some time. Probably Pontet-Canet is the most famous for kind of tilling with the horses. Now they've got about 74 hectares, so it's a reasonably big estate there. And their plantings are 62% Cabernet, 36% Merlot, 1% Franc, 1% Verdot. And again, that's more Cabernet, less Franc than they used to have in the past as well. And the quality has been all the better for it. It's just been getting better and better. And it's increased in size quite a bit over the years as well. Everything there is farmed organically now, entirely organically, I think 100% from the 2018 vintage. So I think most of the grapes in this one that we're trying are organic, but from next year it's 100% organic. Now, as far as winemaking, you're looking at an average of 50 to 60% new oak in this wine, 18 to 20 months. So reasonably long. Now, in this particular vintage here, in 2017, we ended up with 62% Cabernet, 36% Merlot, 2% Petit Verdot, 60% new oak in this year. But this is a vintage that I think is extremely elegant for Rauzan Segla. There's some vintages for them where I think, especially during the Parker era, they were using a lot more new oak than they are now. And some people thought the wines were not tasting very much like Margaux and some of the more powerful vintages, because they were really pushing for strong, deep dark wines, and they were losing a little bit of that classic Margaux elegance and the classic perfume that we like to see from them. But so it's nice to see over the last kind of 5 or 6 vintages that they've really reverted to a classic Margaux now that Parker's not rating the wines anymore. 13% alcohol in this vintage. Again, alcohol is much lower than they have been over some previous vintages. And the Grand Vin that we're tasting here is 55% of the harvest. And that's another reason why all of these Bordeaux are just so much better in vintages like this than they ever were in the past, 20, 30 years ago. 30 years ago, this wine, even at a vintage like this, probably would have been made up of 85% of the harvest would have still been going into the Grand Vin. Now everybody has second wines. Everybody doesn't mind selling off fruit, and everybody is so quality focused. That's why they just don't have those bad vintages of Bordeaux anymore. Not only are climatic conditions changing, they've got the technology, they've got the money, and they also have the desire to make the wines as great as they can be as well, which that desire certainly, and the desire and the money wasn't always there. And that's kind of that bad period that they had in Margaux during the 1970s, where there were a lot of dire wines made, including from Chateau Margaux itself. Wow, I love the nose on this.
Wonderful start to the second flight, Regan. You can see why these are just, I said at the beginning, they're just too delicious.
Yeah, so delicious, so drinkable. I mean, that's, again, a wine I could absolutely drink tonight for dinner.
You think to, a number of times we try a Bordeaux vintage on arrival, and, this is on arrival. These have just been released. And, we're sitting there going, oh God, the tannins, we're searching for something to put for some relief in between wines, but you're not with these.
Were they this approachable out of barrel as well as, or perhaps not quite so much? Or?
No, I was actually just, I've got my notebook here on when I tasted them in barrel, and my notes then are that it was pleasurable as well. And actually, Stephen, that's a really good point. There's no decanting here, because we have preserved these in the way that we have to actually send them out to you. There's definitely been no decanting. It's only been if you've done it. And I would say what I'm finding with the little bottles, and we've done a lot of tasting like this now, is because we're opening the wines without the absence of air and shoving them into a small bottle with no air, it's, in a way, it seems to actually be, I don't know how to quite explain it, but you need to give them some air to open up. It's kind of like it's capturing them and holding them tight. And when you put that in context with the fact that we've done that to these as well, you're right, it's even more impressive.
What I've been doing with kind of like I did in the Alto tasting in this one as well, is I've actually started opening them at about 5 o'clock in those little bottles. I think it makes a little bit of a difference, and getting them into the glasses probably a good 30 minutes before the tasting starts as well, just to try and get a little bit more into them. Though I mean, these are just so approachable anyway. I mean, they probably didn't need it.
There's another set of things we can practice and play with. How do they change in the little bottles before a tasting?
Yeah.
All the things pre-COVID we never thought we'd be experimenting with. Good Lord. Right. Should we move on to the next wine? Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to Pessac. So as we saw in the map at the beginning, you've got the city of Bordeaux, and then north of that, you've got the Medoc. And now where we're going is down to Pessac, to the Graves area, which is sort of south of Bordeaux, although it's not really south of Bordeaux, because the city of Bordeaux has very much swallowed up this area. So Haut Lafitte, you can see the lovely label there. It's got an 800-year history. Absolutely incredible. So 1365, de Bosque was actually planted on the plateau that was called Lafitte, and that's where the name comes from, so the Lafitte part of it. And the Smith part of it actually comes from George Smith, who was the owner in 1720. Moving forward, and 1990, it was actually sold to the current owners, and they have been the owners since then. And really with Smith Haut Lafitte, it's a property that you would very easily overlook. And in fact, before, I think it was around 2000, you probably would have been wise to overlook it, because the quality wasn't what it is today. It's really taken a change, and a change in the right direction. And there's a number of reasons why that is it does all stem from the change in ownership that came in 1990, but it took them a long time to get it to the stage where it actually changed, or the quality of the glass changed. Amazing number of things that they did. 1995, they built their own cooperage. So they make 70% of their own barrels, which is very, very rare in sort of any region, but they now make 70% of their own barrels. In 2009, they introduced satellite imagery to find the perfect moment for picking their grapes. So we've gone from a property that's making average Bordeaux to now someone with their own coopers, and they're using satellites to work out when to pick it. They then have optical sorting. So running through an optical sorter, only the right berries, or the ones that meet the criteria that's selected, are selected for the wine. 78 hectare vineyard, so nice big size vineyard there, with average vine age of 65 years. So we've got all this modern technology, then on the backdrop of, we've got some really old vine age. Density, when they started, 7,500 vines per hectare. They are also increasing planting and pushing that towards 9,000. They have a huge array of different parcels through the vineyard, and it's probably actually their satellite use that's showing them all the different, that the parcels are so jolly different. But they have 140 different parcels that they pick and keep separate. They have the vineyard now being managed with organic principles. It is also, the entire property is self-sustainable, and they've got an eye on biodynamics. So that's where they're heading next. Interestingly, they have two consultants that work for them, so Hollande and Darrencourt, and they're pretty smart Bordelais consultants, and you can usually, where you're seeing a huge qualitative shift quite quickly, guarantee that one of those guys is somewhere nearby. They're not cheap to use, hence you can usually see their stamp relatively quickly. 60 to 70% new French oak being used now, and as I said before, 70% of that being from their own barrels, and it's generally around sort of 18 months that it stays in oak. So let's have a little taste of this one and see whether all the chat about the quality is where it should be. Wow, that nose, that's beautifully expressive, isn't it? Oh, I love this wine. Incidentally, we've started buying more of this wine for good reason. Apart from the fact I just love it. It's brilliant. 60% Cabernet, 35% Merlot, and 4% Cabernet Franc, 1% Petit Verdot in there.
I absolutely love the nose on this wine, Liz. It's just gorgeous.
Great, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a few other little technical bits on it. 13.5% ABV, sorry. 3.7% pH. September 11th to 29th in terms of the harvest. So you can see there, I mean, the nose is gorgeous, the palate, you know, it's just so round and generous, but then with this beautiful elegance and finesse to it as well. The sad news is only 40% of their normal production. So very, very low yields, and really badly affected by the frost, unfortunately. But I think the resulting wine, the quality's there 100%. It's beautiful. Yeah, we've got lots of people liking this wine here. Yeah, the richness and roundness of it. Yeah, it's got that, I think when you get to Pessac, or to the Graves area, you know, you get this density to the wines. And I don't mean density in terms of them being heavy, but you get a completeness with Pessac. So Graves typically, you know, if we looked at that St. Julian before and it sort of had a linear nature to it and a savoury aspect to it, or you looked at that Pauillac and it had the power. You know, when you get to Graves, there's a richness and a completeness to them. I think that's probably the best way that, well, the way that I would explain the wines from that region.
Liz, we've just got someone who lost the Zoom and they're just trying to get back in again.
I've just get them back in. Cool.
Perfect.
Thank you. Well, so yeah, brilliant wine, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
Cool. So I can't see who that is asked the question there, but in terms of the difference between the bottles when we're opening them and then John, so the question is, have we noticed much difference between the bottles upon opening them and then from the small bottles? The answer is no, because when we're opening them in the same environment that we're putting them into the bottles. So we've got rid of the air, and all we're doing before we do that is taking a carbon to them to check for cork taint. So we're not actually tasting them before we're putting them into the bottles. We're just purely looking for cork taint, because you know, it'd be stupid to put them all into little bottles and send you a whole lot of corked wines. So we're using a carbon just to take a small amount out for that purpose. But then other than that, yeah. So hopefully, John, that answered your question on that.
It does. And I suppose the French haven't learned from the Kiwi yet about the screw caps. Maybe someday.
Yeah, maybe never. They're French, yeah? Cool. Right, over to you, Regan. We're going to move to the other side.
Okay. All right, so we're moving to the right bank for these last two wines. So I'll tell you a little bit about Pomerol. Stephen's asking if we've come across many corked wines during the process. I don't think we've had actually, I think we did have a corked bottle of Alto, Stephen, during that tasting, and that's the only one out of all of the tastings we've done so far. So there's been one. I mean, I actually find it's significantly rarer to find a corked bottle than kind of the numbers that are out there. But then, you know, the flip side of that, of course, is that we're generally opening wines from producers who are putting really quality corks into them and have some really stringent testing methods as well. So we're not going to find cork bottles at the kind of same rate that might be out there if you considered every cork in every kind of wine around the world. Right. So Pomerol, the smallest of the appellations that we're kind of looking at tonight. And I mean, it's got some of the most expensive sought after wines in the world in this appellation. You've got Chateau Petrus, Chateau Lafleur, and Chateau Lapin, really the three most expensive wines in all of Bordeaux, is to be found in this appellation here. But if you visit Pomerol, you wouldn't know it. There's no Grand Chateau here at all. Lots of the top chateaux don't even have signs. Very, very difficult to find them. I mean, it's been pretty normal in the last few years to finally put up some signage because of visitors to Bordeaux. Oh, there you go. Anne-Marie saying she could see the frost damage in Pomerol. in 2017, yeah, they really got hit quite badly in some areas of Pomerol. Now, again, Pomerol was planted very, very early, probably around a similar time to Margaux, in terms of around about 2,000 years ago. And they think that Saint Emilion really started producing commercial wines at a grand scale in the early 1300s and exporting those wines to England. But Pomerol was still an afterthought at that time. Most of the region still wasn't under vine. Really started to produce as a commune that was known around about the 1700s. And you had lots of farmers starting to convert their crops from wheat and produce to grapes, because look, you've got all this like clay, gravel, sandy soils in Pomerol that just weren't really that great for producing anything else, to be honest. And by the end of the 18th century, you had about 400 hectares under vines. It's still a very, very small areas. And you had a bit of white wine being produced here during this period, and that started to get phased out around kind of now as well. So around about this time, around 1800, this is when a lot of the grand chateaux in the left bank and the Medoc were being built. And Pomerol really wasn't considered an appellation at all. It was considered somewhere that just made pretty ordinary kind of simple quaffing wines at that stage there. You had around about 1853, they built the kind of the port in there, and you started to get some more wines starting to leave the area. The Dutch were huge fans of Pomerol during this time, and not really anybody else. That was where most of the export was. They started to earn some medals at the kind of Paris exhibition in 1878, and people started to take a bit more notice of the wines of Pomerol. But they got ravaged by kind of phylloxera at the end of that century as well, and didn't really get back up to speed until kind of early 1920s. The appellation came about 1936 in Pomerol there, and it was agreed at that stage that, you know, you had to be within the appellation, and that's there. Actually, Rory's got a question about frost protection in Bordeaux. Do they use modern frost protection? Do they use windmills? Do they use helicopters? Absolutely they do. Certainly at the estates we're looking at here in Pomerol, like, you know, Petrus, Fleur Petrus, Edward and Christian Moeks were one of the first to use helicopters for frost fighting in Bordeaux, and it was a huge news story. I think worldwide, they were one of the very first estates in the entire world to use helicopters for frost fighting protection. So it was pretty interesting at the time. People thought it was ridiculous to be spending that much money. And then you can see how the price of the wines has kind of skyrocketed since then. Now, Pomerol's the only major appellation in all of Bordeaux that's not classified. So there's no classification in here at all. Most of the wines are absolutely Merlot dominant, with perhaps a little bit of Cabernet Franc in most of the wines as well. You'll find very little Cabernet Sauvignon, very little Petit Verdot over this side. Really, they're Merlot primarily. Cabernet Franc is the kind of the secondary wine. Now, at this stage here, you've got most of the wine in the modern era from Pomerol wasn't really being exported. They made some astonishingly good wines in Pomerol through the 1940s and the 1950s. But really, the exports for Pomerol was going to Belgium. Belgium was a huge market for Pomerol at this time, and most of it was going there in barrel. None of the Pomerol producers were bottling their own. They didn't have the facilities. They didn't have the money. It was much easier to just sell your wine in barrel to negotiants and ship it off. So even wines like Petrus from the 1940s and 1950s, there's lots of different bottlings out there with different negotiant labels on them, because a lot of them weren't being estate bottled at this time. And then they were talking about frost. Pomerol was absolutely hammered by frost in 1956. Most of the vineyards lost at least 90% of their vines, and it was so bad that they had to pull the vines out. So you don't find a lot of super old vines in Pomerol anymore because of that great frost in 56. But it was probably actually better for most of the growers in the long run because they pulled out a lot of the Cabernet Sauvignon that they had and began planting more Merlot, because they realized, look, Merlot was much better for them on those clay-based soils in Pomerol than it was on the gravels on the left bank. And so it was probably the best thing that ever happened for them. Now, what really made Pomerol famous was the 1982 vintage in Robert Parker. especially Chateau Petrus, Chateau Fleur, Rauzan. He gave those wines huge scores, and it was really the first time that that people in the UK, people in the United States started to take massive interest in Pomerol. And it was Jean-Pierre Moeks who really started to popularize the region around about that time as well. It was the kind of the drive of him and his father. They started the Moeks kind of negotiant business in 1937, but they owned Chateau Trotanoir, Chateau Fleur Petrus, of course, and eventually Petrus as well. And so he was kind of the unofficial spokesperson for the entire region, traveling around the world, talking about the wines of Pomerol. They were getting all of these huge scores from the world's biggest wine critic, you know, who made his kind of fortune based on the back of this 1982 vintage. So that's kind of how it all took off. Now, let's look at the wine that we've got in front of us here. Very, very exciting because I love this wine. So this is glass number 3. Hopefully if this catches up to where we want to be here. Okay, that first slide's just showing where we're looking here on the right back there. And you can see Pomerol, and you can see how much smaller Pomerol is compared to Saint-Emilion. You've got a lot of the satellites of Pomerol and Saint-Emilion around there as well. But only 800 hectares in Pomerol. They're a pretty small region. All right, Chateau Fleur Petrus. You guys have probably tried it already. I haven't tried it yet. I've been jabbering on. So let's give it a taste. Wow, I can see the darkness of the nose here. I could keep on tasting that for another minute, but I'm going to have to stop because otherwise you'll all be waiting for me. I think before we talk any further about that, we can see how different that is to all the other wines. And that's because we're looking at 93% Merlot here, 5% Franc, 2% Petit Verdot in this vintage. Le Fleur Petrus is absolutely one of the greatest estates in the region, and clearly taking its name from its closest neighbors, Chateau Le Fleur, on one side of it and Chateau Petrus on the other side of it, two of the most famous and the most expensive names in the world of wine. Now the estate kind of has a really long history, but it's not that exciting. Unlike the estates of the left bank, the estates of Pomerol weren't owned by dukes, the noblemen, you know, huge investment banks at the time, you know, lords, presidents of France. Pomerol and Saint-Emilion is really, the estates have always been owned by farmers. They're very, very small estates, and they don't have grand chateau. And so there's not all that much interesting in their history when you look back, especially something like this that has really been owned by the same family for a very, very long time until it was sold in 1953 to Jean-Pierre Moeks. And he bought it from the Garrett family who had owned it at that time. And previously it was the property of numerous owners, including the Arnaud family who owned Petrus. And of course the Moeks family owned Petrus, and they owned Le Fleur Petrus as well. Now, when they bought it in 1953, they pretty soon after that, actually there's a good picture of Pomerol itself, and you can see how small Pomerol is. And on this particular map, all the estates are really, really jammed in there, and you can see there's a few different kind of sub-regions within Pomerol that we'll talk about there. But what happened when they bought it in 1953, they also bought 4 additional hectares of vines. The Moeks family brought them from neighboring Chateau Leongan at the time. But the estate of, the reputation of this estate really dates back a very long time to the 1800s. Now, when they bought it, it was already named Le Fleur Petrus. That name had it for a very, very long time. And they brought it in 1953. And then, of course, the vineyard was absolutely devastated in 1956. So they actually made only, I think, 2 vintages from it before they had to replant the whole vineyard, couldn't produce any fruit off it for another couple of years. They added another 4 hectares of vines in 1994. And again, those came from the famous neighbor, Chateau Leguet as well, also owned by the Moeks family. So they've really been investing heavily in the Fleur Petrus over the years, trying to increase those holdings. And you can see there, Le Fleur Petrus actually has one of the grandest buildings that you will find in Pomerol. It almost looks a little bit like a chateau. And these guys have really been on a roll since probably 1998, which was a great vintage for Pomerol. The depth and richness of Le Fleur Petrus has just got better and better every single year, and the scores have been going up and up and up. If we looked at the size of those estates on the left bank there, we were looking at kind of 90 hectares, 150 hectares. We're 18.7 hectares here for Le Fleur Petrus. And planting wise, 91% Merlot, 6% Franc, 3% Petit Verdot. And that's quite a big change for them. Previously, they used to have about 80% Merlot planted in the vineyards, and they had about 20% Cabernet Franc planted. So they've upped their Merlot percentage significantly, and they brought the Cabernet Franc down quite a bit, and they've planted a little bit of Petit Verdot, which they previously didn't have in there at all. Now, if you look at the different subsections of Pomerol, the best section of Pomerol is the Plateau of Pomerol. Now, this is a very old picture there, but it shows you how well situated Le Fleur Petrus is there. So the 3 different green sections that you see there are the 3 different parcels owned by Le Fleur Petrus. And you can see Le Fleur across the road there, Hosanna, squished in between, Trotanoir, Le Pan, and Petrus itself. And the Plateau of Pomerol is the highest point of Pomerol, and it has the best terroir across there. So you've got these 3 main blocks. In the northern blocks, you're finding more gravel. And in the southern block there, the one marked 3, you're finding a little bit more clay. And that block in the center near the chateau, that's a slightly warmer microclimate with a little bit more gravel. And that highest point of the vineyard here, we're looking at about 38 meters above sea level. So it's not particularly high at any point here. Now, Petrus itself, and to a lesser extent, Fleur, are very famous for the blue clay section that they sit on. In fact, Petrus is almost entirely on this blue clay. And it's the only kind of area of blue clay that they've found exactly like this anywhere in the world. They've found a very similar one that sits under the vineyard of Maceto. But it's really Maceto and Petrus are the only 2 places anywhere in the world where they've found this particular very million-year-old blue clay. So there is a lot of clay in the plateau, but Le Fleur Petrus, their vineyards are actually a little bit more gravel with clay holding it together as well. So you've got small gravel stones, clay soils. Now, when they make this, I think starting with the 2013 vintage, these wines have, actually you can see some of the big kind of gravel stones that are sitting in the vineyard there. And those are all Merlot vines we're looking at there, and they're absolutely heaving in that picture. Now, starting with the 2013 vintage, they actually make the wines of Le Fleur Petrus at Chateau Hosanna, which is, again, also owned by the Moeks family. So they own most of the top estates of Pomerol. And this new location is just a lot more modern, a lot more functional for them as well. So they've got that classical French kind of building now, but they don't really use the original farmhouse anymore that Le Fleur Petrus was based out of for about 100 years. And I think the first vintage that included Petit Verdot in the blend was the 2015 vintage. So prior to that, there was no Petit Verdot at all. They've got 2 laser sorting tables in use since 2009. They only started using stainless steel for the fermentation here in 2004. So it's been very traditionally made for a very long time. Traditionally, not much new oak here. Most vintages, it ranges between 30% and 50% new oak. And as opposed to the perhaps 15 to 30,000 cases we're seeing out of the left bank here, these guys are only making 6,000 cases of wine per year. So not a lot of wine at all.
Yeah, it's
Right, so this particular vintage here, yeah.
brilliant wine.
Yeah, you got this, yeah.
Sorry, I was
Yeah,
going to say
absolutely.
it's brilliant. Just on the soil, just one other thing to note there, and on the vineyard, is it's very high in iron. So whilst they're not on that blue clay, they've got a very specific soil that runs through that vineyard, particularly around where the chateau is. And I think that that sort of characteristic, you know, when you hear it's very high in iron, I think there's something in this wine that sort of correlates there. The other thing is, in terms of organics, I did ask Edward when we're standing there, you know, are you thinking of organics? What are you doing? And he said everything will be in balance. He said, I'm not going to be constrained by anything, and I will do what the vineyard needs to sustain for future generations. So that's very much his philosophy. Yeah.
I mean,
I gave you time to try the wine.
I mean, it's such a classy wine. I mean, it's so, and when we think of wines with that much Merlot in there, we don't think of wines that are that black in style, that much dark fruit. And you can see there's a heap of tannin there, but the tannins in that wine are incredibly fine. I mean, you can barely make out the individual tannins. They're so small, they're so tight. And there's a huge amount there. I mean, it's just so classy. Doesn't have the opulence that 15 or 16 has, but I mean, you wouldn't say that was a light wine by any sense. I mean, it's got a huge amount of richness to it. Yeah, I love that wine. And this was the wine that really stood out for us actually in those 2019 on Premier tastings as well as.
Yeah, definitely. They're doing really, really well with it. I think it's, you know, this and the one that we're about to move on to next are the ones that Edward Moeks has decided that he's going to do everything in his generation to put the quality of these as high as he can get them. So on that, we'll perhaps move to the next wine. So we're moving from Pomerol, not very far away, moving to Saint Emilion, and we are sticking with a wine that is also owned by the same family, managed by the same negotiants. This is another J.P. Moeks wine. And it's actually, the property of Belair is a very, very old estate. In fact, it can trace its roots back to the ancient Romans. But if we jump sort of to the late 1916 period, where neighbouring Usone actually purchased it. So that gives you an idea of exactly sort of where it's located. And Usone owned this property for a very long time. But phylloxera ran its way through France, and, you know, with all of the challenges around that and needing to resurrect vineyards, this was one that fell into huge neglect. And it actually stayed very underutilized and underperforming for many years. And it actually was only 2008 that the full ownership moved to the Moeks family. And one of the things that they did do, and sorry, I should note that whilst it was only then that the full ownership moved to them, that before that they had been involved with the viticulture and the vinification. It's just that they took over full ownership at that point. So they'd already restored it to a stage where, you know, they were starting to produce some pretty smart wines off it. But they changed the name of it to Belair Monange in 2008. And why they did that was Christian Moeks, so Edward's father, his grandmother was Anne Adele Monange, who was one of the first women to settle in the area of Saint Emilion. So they've added her last name to pay respect to her, which is very, very cool. 2012 was then another significant moment for this property because it became larger. And Chateau Magdalen was actually merged with Chateau Belair Monange in 2012. And it became the size that it is today. So it gobbled up Magdalen at that stage. Edward Moeks is now very much in charge, and, you know, whilst he loves and adores Chateau Fleur Petrus that we looked at before, this is the property that he's got his eyes on, and believes that the terroir here is so strong that he can make a wine that can rival the very best from Pomerol and Saint Emilion. So this is, with someone like that putting that much attention and focus into it and making such bold statements as to what he believes the quality can be, this is very much a property to watch. And having tasted it, I think I've now tasted 10 consecutive vintages of it on release. I've had the pleasure of watching that evolution, and he's definitely on a roller coaster with this. It's incredible. 2009, there's a picture of him there. You can see how proud he is of this wine. 2009, they started optical sorting. They do have 2 optical sorters. It's a 23.5 hectare vineyard now. And the terroir is very specific. It's actually limestone up on top of the plateau and clay. So there's parts that are clay, but then limestone is more on the slopes there. 40 years of vine age, with the oldest vines now at 70 years old. 6,600 vines per hectare here. In terms of their fermentation, they ferment in concrete vats, and they are using thermoregulation through those vats. 50% new French oak, so it spends 18 months in that. And the blend here is pretty consistent, 90% Merlot and 10% Cabernet Franc. And I think, you know, if you have a taste of it, you'll concur with Regan's comment before that if we think of Merlot as being light and fruity and jammy, it's everything it's not. And this wine will clearly demonstrate that, I would say. Yeah, wow, the nose is captivating. Mm. Mm. Wow, what a blockbuster to finish on. It's incredible. I was looking back at my notes when I tasted this on release, and I think one of the things that I wrote, and it still holds true tonight, is as I was sort of a conscious stream of thought writing my notes, I wrote, is it a little bit overripe? And then I went, hold on a minute, it's not, it's just perfect. And this is a dense wine with a lot of concentration, a lot of power to it, but it's not overripe. It's got just the right amount of balance. One of the characters I really like in it, and it's very much a signature of Saint Emilion and goes with that conversation we've been having tonight about the fact that you can see terroir speaking loudly in these wines, is the wines of Saint Emilion always have this sort of mocha coffee character to them. And, you know, this has that lovely coffee spice on the end of it. You get, yeah, sure, the plum, the generous red fruits from the Merlot, but you've got that mocha spice on the end of it, which that and just the lift from the acidity finishes the wine off beautifully. And yeah, Anne-Marie, I can see why it's your favourite on the right bank tonight. They're both good, but yeah, they're also very, very different, which I think has been one of the cool things that we've seen tonight, is we've seen, you know, 8 exceptional wines that the one thing that you'd say about them is they're just different, but each one of them's brilliant.
Yeah, I think I remember when he came out here and we did a tasting of a number of these right bank wines, and I think he said that he remembered that even back his father talking to his grandfather saying how good the terroir was at Belair Monange and how he thought it was the only terroir on the right bank that could rival Chateau Petrus itself. And that's why the family had always wanted to buy this when it came out. And I think when it was, at one stage, it was purchased by the owner of Chateau, of course, which is one of the other most famous estates in Saint-Emilion. That was in 1916. It was around about that stage, I think, if you look at a lot of the old, I think Christian Moeks said this as well. If you look at a lot of the really old, guides to Bordeaux from the 1800s and before, Chateau Belair was right up there with the top estates of Saint-Emilion, perhaps the top estate of Saint-Emilion, along with Cheval Blanc. But it was after it was purchased in 1916 by the owners of Chateau Rauzan that it started to drop in quality. And one of the major reasons for that was they were taking all of the best fruit from Belair and they were putting it into Rauzan. And they did that for a very, very long time, 50 or 60 years, which was why Rauzan was so highly regarded. And Belair people just forgot about it. A couple of generations went by and people forgot how good that vineyard was because they were taking all the best fruit for it, putting it somewhere else, and they just weren't investing into Belair. And that's something that the Moeks family has absolutely done. They got all of those original vineyards back and they've put a huge amount of money into it. And I think every vintage of this that I've tried since it changed from Belair they're just getting better and better. And I'm actually surprised this vintage has actually got a bit more oomph and a bit more tannin to it, Liz, than I think even the 2016 and the 2015. They're maybe more concentrated, but this has a real tannic structure to it I didn't see in those other vintages.
Yeah, definitely. I think, that's the thing with, both La Fleur Petrus and with Belair is where we're seeing a quality shift each year as well. So whilst, you're looking at it going, why is it so different to the 16 and the others don't show that same difference? You've just got the improvement in quality there. And, you've got to take your hats off to them that, yeah, they're plowing a lot of money into this, but the results are pretty good.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing about this wine, if you look at the price of this wine at $389, it's $200 cheaper than the La Fleur Petrus. They're both owned by the same family. And that family thinks that the terroir and the potential of Belair Monange is significantly higher than the potential of La Fleur Petrus. But they said that they wanted to let the market decide that pricing. They think that this will be one of the greatest wines in Bordeaux within 20 or 30 years. But they didn't want to enforce that pricing on the market. They wanted to produce they wanted to show the quality that this vineyard is capable of producing, and they wanted the market to realize that and let those prices grow organically over time rather than them, enforcing a high price on the market, which is really cool to see. It is creeping up every vintage, but I think these are wines that we're going to look back at these in 20 years time and go, wow, I remember when I could buy Belair Monange for $300 and now it's $1,000 or $1,500 or $2,000, and I think that's where they'll be.
Yeah, we'll be looking back and going, should have bought it then. Cool. Very good. Thank you. Excellent. Do we have any, before Regan, I think, are you going to talk last or do you want me to?
Oh, you can talk last.
I can talk last. Oh, good.
We don't actually have much of these wines to sell, unfortunately. There wasn't all that much left over, but we will send you guys out an email tomorrow with the recording of all of this, and we'll send you out a special offer on these wines as well. I think because there isn't much of these wines available, you would have seen when we've offered them previously, there actually hasn't been much of a discount on them because there isn't actually a lot of them. But because of you guys have come to this tasting tonight, there will be some special pricing for you.
Yeah, cool. Excellent. Well, I hope you've all very much enjoyed the tasting. That's been a great set of wines to go through. I think we would have quietly preferred to do it in person, but this format's pretty cool as well. Speaking of this format, did just want to share with you, we've got some more virtual tastings coming up. So there's some pretty cool ones. There's a gin fest. So if you're into gin, we've got some distillers joining us and we're going to go through a whole lot of different gins, or more, we're going to sit back and enjoy it and let them do the work. We've also got a Domaine Parent, so Pommard 16-17 comparison tasting coming up. We've got a couple of tickets, I think, left to the La Mission Haut Lafitte vertical. And I think the other tasting to alert you to is that we have Taylor's Port. So we've just put that up recently. They're going to be hosting that from Portugal. And that does include, I think, 3, maybe 4 vintage ports. So
300-point vintage ports in that as well. I
Yeah.
think going back to 1994, I think the 100-point is a 94, 2003 and 2016.
Yeah, so that'd be a great way to have a look at a whole heap of different styles of port, and great that they're going to jump online. The other virtual tasting that's up there is we're going to do a rosé tasting and get some of our friends from France to join us for that as well, and some New Zealand producers, and we might try and encourage them to have a little bit of a conversation between the winemakers on different styles of rosé. So that could be quite fun. So those are all up on our website. You just need to type in virtual tastings and they'll pop up, but we'll send you those details with the email tomorrow. So thanks for joining us.
There's one other, Liz, that isn't a virtual tasting, because we've all been stuck at home and probably dying for a little bit of company. We are waiting until level 1, but at the end of October, when we should all be in level 1 in a couple of weeks' time, we've got a dinner, which will be the first dinner we've done in quite some time. It's going to be at Paris Butter, which is one of the favorite restaurants that I've been to over the last couple of years. And it's going to be an Opus 1 dinner, which is just going to be fantastic. We'll be drinking some champagne. We'll be having Opus 1 Overture. We'll be having at least 2 vintages of Opus 1, plus some Quinta de Noval port. And I think that's limited. We'll have the whole restaurant, so we'll only be limited to about 26 people for that dinner. But it's going to be a pretty special evening, and it'll be certainly for a lot of people the first time they might have been out to a dinner in quite some time. So I think that's up online now as well for that Opus 1 dinner. So we had it planned out quite some time ago, and clearly that couldn't happen. So we've rescheduled that. So it's going to be the end of October. I think it's the 28th of October for that dinner. But I'm very much looking forward to that. Drinking those wines actually with dinner rather than a tasting is going to be really fun.
Cool. Very good. So thanks very much for joining us tonight, guys. Hope you've enjoyed that. And yes, certainly the wines have showed brilliantly. So thank you.
Absolutely. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.